Hi guys, and welcome back to A Dinosaur in the Library. I'm Dawn, and thanks for showing up to listen to me ramble about books again. So, usually I'm coming to you to talk about books that I've loved and I've enjoyed and that have made me a happy reader. And tonight I come to you with a depressing video, and I hope you will forgive me for that. But it really occurs to me that a lot of times booktubers will talk about books that they love, but they won't really talk about the books that they disliked. And if they do, they just say, it really wasn't for me, and they give their rating and move on. And they don't really talk about what it is about the book that they didn't like. And I'm not talking about in-depth analysis, but, you know, talking about what it is in a book that we don't like. I think, to me, it enriches the conversation about books. So tonight, I'm coming to you with 3 recent disappointments. And I really hope that if you're watching this and you've read any of these, and you have an opinion you'd like to share, that you'll have this conversation with me in the comments, because I'm always fascinated when I read things that are not, like, so take Twilight, to use a very obvious example. From my experience, you either love that series or you cannot stand it and wish it was obliterated from the earth. I tend to fall toward the second camp. I don't really want it obliterated, but I certainly wouldn't read it. But there are plenty of people who love it. And, you know, that's great. But I've talked to several people about why they like it. And it's always fascinating to me to see what it is that people like about things that I despise. So... And I always also want to know, if I loved a book but somebody else didn't like it, I'm always pressing to see what it is they didn't like about it. Just because it's interesting to me to see the variations in experience. Because what you're talking about is, unless they borrowed the copy from you, what you're talking about is 2 completely different physical objects that are exactly the same, for the most part, but you had 2 completely different experiences of them. And I don't know why that fascinates me so, because everybody has a different experience of everything, but with books, it's twice as fascinating for me. So I always want to talk to people about it. So if you've read any of the 3 of these, and you have differing or the same opinions as I do, please comment down below, let me know. Or if you, after seeing this video, decide you want to read one of them, or all of them, please do, and please come back and let me know what you thought of them. Or if you make a video or a blog about them, let me know and I will go read it or watch it, because I would love to have this sort of virtual conversation about how our experiences differed with these books. So I'm going to start with the one I liked the least, but also the one that disappointed me the least, if that makes sense, or it will in a minute. So anyway, the one, I just finished this one today, and that's Flatland, A Romance of Many Dimensions by Edwin A. Abbott. Yeah, I bought this one this year. It's one of the Signet editions, Signet Classics edition. So it was a really, you know, small, cheap book. So it breaks my heart a little less that I didn't like it, because I didn't pay that much for it. But I was kind of disappointed by this. It's a classic of science fiction, and I'm just going to read you the back because it's a little strange to explain. With wry humor and penetrating satire, Flatland takes us on a mind-expanding journey into a different world to give us a new vision of our own. A Square, the slightly befuddled narrator, is born into a place limited to 2 dimensions, irrevocably flat, and peopled by a hierarchy of geometrical forms. In a Gulliver-like tour of his bizarre homeland, A Square spins a fascinating tale of domestic drama and political turmoil, from sex among consenting triangles to the intentional subjugation of Flatland's females. He tells of visits to Lineland, the world of 1 dimension, and Pointland, the world of no dimension. But when A Square dares to speak openly of a 3rd or even a 4th dimension, his tragic fate climaxes a brilliant parody of Victorian society. An underground favorite since its publication in England in 1884, Flatland is as prophetic a science fiction classic as the works of H.G. Wells, introducing aspects of relativity and hyperspace years before Einstein's famous theories, and it does so with a wonderful, enduring enchantment. From the description, this should have been a 5-star immediate add to my favorite shelf that I would be rereading in the future and never getting rid of. And what it actually ended up being was a 1-star disappointment that I will be clearing off my shelf soon to make room for ones that I do love. I'm disappointed by this. because, as you know, if you've been here more than 5 minutes, I adore H.G. Wells, and anything that's compared to H.G. Wells interests me. And it's a classic of sci-fi, so of course I wanted to read it, because I do really like sci-fi, and honestly I thought I'd read this before, but unless I blocked it completely out, which I suppose is possible, I realized that I hadn't, and which is why I bought this copy. But I'm going to tell you, I was completely bored to tears by this book. I pushed through the end because even including the afterword, it's only 156 pages. So if I'm reading a large novel and it's kind of slow, I'll give it 100 or 150 pages before I DNF it or set it aside to read later. So I figured I might as well just finish this one. And it was a struggle. I mean, this is a really short book, and I read fairly quickly, even when I'm busy, and it took me like 5 days to get through this, and it was awful. I don't really know, and I said this on Goodreads, I'm not really even sure what it is, other than maybe just the boredom that made me not like this book, because the concept is fascinating to me. The satire, the political and social, metaphors, I find that fascinating when I read things like that. But this just bored me to death. And it wasn't that it had to do with geometry or math kind of concepts, because I've been known to read 3 or 4 different biographies of the number 0, or, books about astrophysics. Even if I don't completely understand the math, I'll still read them and enjoy them. But this one... This was a short disappointment. So, that is number 1. The second book got a 2-star rating. And I was more disappointed by this one than Flatland. Again, the description, it just failed to live up to its description. And that's Triangle, a novel by Catherine Weber. And you may have seen me haul this year. I got it from Goodwill. Toward the beginning of the year, or the beginning, I can't remember if I got it at the beginning of the summer or beginning of the year, but either way, I haven't had it a terrible long time. But it's a fictional novel about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and I'll read you the description, right? By the time she dies at age 106, Esther Gottsfeld, the last survivor of the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, has told the story of that day many times. But her own role remains mysterious. How did she survive when at least 146 workers, her sister and fiancé among them, burned or jumped to their deaths? Are the gaps in her story just common mistakes, or has she deliberately concealed a secret over the years? As her granddaughter seeks the real story in the present day, a zealous feminist historian intrudes with her own set of conclusions, but it is Esther's voice echoing insistently through the decades that ultimately reveals the meaning of the tragedy. A brilliant, haunting chronicle of the event that stood for 90 years as New York's most violent disaster, Triangle forces us to consider how we tell our stories, how we hear them, and how history is forged from unverifiable truth. Another book that, based on the description, should have gone immediately to my 5-star I love this bookshelf. It's gonna get unhauled pretty soon. The only reason it got 2 stars instead of 1 is that this is told in several different viewpoints. So one viewpoint is that of, it's not through her granddaughter's eyes, but it's about her granddaughter and her granddaughter's boyfriend in the current time. This came out several years back, so not like today, but, recent. Then you also have sections where you're seeing transcripts of interviews between Esther, who's the survivor, and this feminist historian. And those are really cool. Then you've got sections that are historical fiction that are Esther telling the story of her life at the time of the fire and of the day of the fire and all of that. Those second 2 sections were great, and they are the sole reason that I finished this. Even though, as you can see, it's not a very thick novel. It's 200 and some odd pages. But I honestly thought about putting this down and just not finishing it because of the other sections about her granddaughter and the boyfriend. And it's primarily the sections about the boyfriend. So he's a musician whose original compositions cause tangible changes in the environment. He wrote This is toward the very beginning, and it's not like a main character or anything that dies, so I'm not spoiling anything. But some friend of theirs dies, and he writes a Requiem for him. And people listening to it become ill. So this kind of thing. And the concept of that is actually very interesting to me. But there is so much just random musical terminology and almost musical theory that are thrown in there that it's practically unreadable. And it's not that I don't like weird and esoteric topics. I mean, like I said before, I'll read 3 or 4 biographies of the number 0 and be happy. Or read, microhistories of the most obscure, weird stuff and just be having the best time ever. But this was almost like the author knew for some reason or learned about all of this specific stuff about music in order to create this character, and just felt like she had to jam every single bit of it into the story. Almost as like, it needs to have value in the real world somewhere, so I have to jam it into this book. And if the sections with the granddaughter and the boyfriend weren't there, I think that this would have been maybe at least a 3-star, but the characterization of the feminist scholar really would have knocked it down anyway. Although, you really don't get any characterization of her except in the sections with the granddaughter and the boyfriend, so if those had been cut out, I probably would have been fine with this book. As many of you know, if you've been here a while, one of my undergraduate degrees is in women's studies. So, I was immediately like, oh, a feminist scholar, this is kind of cool. But she's characterized terribly. She's essentially a caricature of women's studies scholars. The terrible jokes that people make about feminist scholars, that's what she is. She's self-serving and pretentious and just horrible. And you don't like her, I don't know that you're supposed to like her, but she's put in there as just a point she's put in there with really no good reason. Honestly, you could have done without her. The sections with the interviews weren't necessary. You could have gotten the story and I think I would have enjoyed that the most of all if she had just written the book as a historical novel starting with Esther and her sister coming to the U.S. That would have been great. You'd have gotten the story, she could have told it, in flashback and whatever, and it would have been great, and it probably would have been a 4 or 5-star read, but as it's written, it was barely a 2-star read, and the plot with Esther, with the historical fiction sections with Esther telling her own story were really the only things that saved it from a 1-star for me. Incredible disappointment. But the book that disappointed me the absolute most over the past few months, and actually this is the book that has disappointed me the most in quite some time, because usually I don't dislike books this much, and this actually got a 3-star rating, but I not because the book itself was that good, but it's Living with a Wild God, a Non-Believer's Search for the Truth About Everything by Barbara Ehrenreich. And again, if you've been here a while, you will have heard me recommend Barbara Ehrenreich before. She wrote Nickel and Dimed and Bait and Switch. Nickel and Dimed is one of my favorite nonfiction books ever, and I will be recommending that book for all eternity, unless something better comes around, because it was just a really honest, accurate portrayal of the experience of working poor people in the U.S. This book was something entirely different, and it was supposed to be something entirely different. This was talking about what most people would think of as spiritual experiences or mystical experiences, but she was raised atheist and really didn't have that point of reference in her mind, in her background. So the things that she experienced, she didn't really have a name for, and I'll tell you, really it wasn't the fact that I thought she was a crackpot or anything like that. I think what bothered me most was her tone throughout most of this, because a lot of it is sections of her journal from when she was young all the way up through teenage years, and you know how when you're 15 or 16, everything seems like it's just the worst thing that's ever happened to you, and you're the only person it's ever happened to. I mean, almost everybody's like this, so this is not a judgment upon 15 or 16-year-olds, because I was like this. You know, everything that happens is the worst thing that's ever happened to anybody in the whole wide world, and in fact, nobody else has ever had this happen to them, except you. So, and you're a special, unique snowflake that is just suffering more than anybody else. And that's just the experience of adolescence for most people, at least for a little while, even if not for multiple years. But the tone in this book sounds like she never outgrew that. And if you've read it and disliked it, maybe you know what I'm talking about. But it bothered me. The tone bothered me through the entire book. And it made me miserable. I didn't want to finish the book, but I did, because I kept hoping it was going to get better. It's Barbara Ehrenreich. It's got to get better, right? It has to get better. And it just never really redeemed itself. And I think I only gave it 3 stars because I really do like Barbara Ehrenreich for some of her other work. And I just couldn't bear to give a Barbara Ehrenreich book less than 3 stars. But it really was probably a 1.5 to 2 star book, if I'm being 100% honest. Like I said at the beginning, if you've read any or all of these, please let's have a conversation. I would love to know what it is you love about these books, so that I can, just make a comparison. And if you have the same opinion as I do, I would love to see what you didn't like about the books and see, how that compares. So let's have a conversation about it. If you've never read any of them, maybe pick one of them up and see what you think. It could end up being your new favorite book. Who knows? There are plenty of people who love books that I absolutely despise and would never read again. Jane Austen, case in point. I don't like Jane Austen, but people love her, and I've never been able to make that match up. But I would love to have a conversation about why I dislike these books so much, or why you like them so much. So leave me comments down below. If you've made videos about them, let me know. I really didn't go looking for booktube videos about them because I just like them so much. So, although I probably should have. Anyway, that's all I had for tonight. I rambled on a little longer than I meant to, but it's really late and I've had a long day and I tend to run off at the mouth when I'm tired for some reason. So I hope everybody is having a wonderful week. Thanks for sticking with me, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye.